I was looking, we did something like over 40 of these in 2020. And 2021 has started off with as many inclusion challenges as 2020 had. And in conversation with leaders, I've been talking about this idea that the workplace is the only place where we still have to come together. We can't retreat into any bubbles. We can't, we can choose where we live. We can choose who we hang out with. We can choose who, all of those things. But the workplace is where we all come together across the diversity spectrum. And it is in the workplace that I truly believe we can start to come back together, and see each other's humanity and see each other's diversity in a beautiful way. And so the power of the workplace and the power of each of you doing this work and staying engaged, when it's hard and when it's messy and all of those things, I just appreciate it. And I'm glad to be on the inclusion and belonging journey with each one of you, and really looking forward to this series in 2021, and thrilled to be kicking it off with Mike Hess, who is the founder of the Blind Institute of Technology. And Mike and I have been sort of connected in an ancillary way for over a year. And then we had our first conversation sometime in November, December, and we literally like we couldn't stop talking. And then our second conversation was the same, and I said, Mike, you have to come on Every Day in Inclusion and Belonging, and we just have to jam and talk about a whole variety of things. So Mike, welcome. Introduce yourself, because I won't do you justice, and tell everybody what you're up to, and what the Blind Institute of Technology is up to.
Thank you so much, Mo. Really appreciate it, and Happy New Year. Although I totally agree with you, the challenges that we're facing already are astounding to me, and unfortunately, I wouldn't say way too many people. Unfortunately, way too influential people are really attempting to identify people's differences. And as a blind person, like, I truly believe that we, because I listen, when you listen to people, and truly listen, like a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm hearing you, but listening is, you're being super intentional about it. And even if you're from the deaf community, people who are signing, it's one thing to watch somebody signing. It's another thing to attempt to interpret that. So that's that extra layer of being intentional about paying attention and attempting to interpret. But as a blind person, I'm always, fascinated to hear about people talking about, what differences we have. And if you sit back and just close your eyes and start listening to people more often, you're going to find out that we as a humanity have way more in common than we do differences. And the workplace is absolutely the environment where you can see that we really, because, unless you're truly born with no financial need at all, which, I mean, it's less than 1% of humanity that is born like that, we all have to attempt to earn our own nickel. And workplaces, the vast majority of workplaces, they're looking for skills. They're looking for people to advance their business mission and that sort of thing. And it is a melting pot so many times, and it's really where we can shed those so-called differences and start to come together with a single mission, and that's to advance the business that we're working with. And my background is it's all private sector. It's all tech. I started out as a developer, Mo. Moved into network engineering, and telecommunications is my background. And if you can route it over the network, if you can route it and you can bill for it, it's a product within telecommunications. And that was kind of my experience. So almost 20 years in the private sector is kind of my background, all tech, all nerd. And it was very evident to me that I was always the token blind person.
Yep.
And so therefore as I was getting into my 40s and wanted to do something bigger, that's when I really stepped up and said, okay, let's think bigger. And bigger to me is Blind Institute of Technology. It's we act as a nonprofit staffing agency where we work with some of the biggest companies in the world on their diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging initiatives that's solely focused on the people with disabilities community. So how do we truly get away from that tokenism that I experienced over my entire career? It's the demographic, the unemployment numbers for the people with disabilities community are egregious here in the United States,
Yes.
and they get worse across the globe. And so BIT is just simple. It's a simple business concept. We match organizations looking for talent with individuals that have that talent. So there's a lot more that goes into that, but in short, that's kind of what we do. But I'll stop there because I threw a lot of spaghetti against the wall, and I'd love to see what sticks with you.
Well, Mike, I think it's important for us there were a couple things that I want to unpack before we sort of get into ideas and solutions around it. One is let's start with the stats, because I think those are really important to understand. And two, then let's talk about this idea, some of the social things, right? Around, you talked about tokenism and beliefs, some I would say unconscious and some I would say very conscious about people with disabilities and their abilities in the workplace. So first, I know that you can rattle off some stats for me around it, and it is egregious. And I'll flip that on its head, and I'll say for organizations that are sort of waving a flag right now and saying that they want more diversity in their organizations, there is an incredibly rich, overqualified, underemployed pool of talent in people with disabilities. And so I would say that if you want to start hiring for, looking at what I would say sort of some of the vanity numbers, looking at some of the diversity numbers, you're going to find so many qualified people when you look to people with disabilities because of these egregious unemployment stats. So hit me up with some of them, Mike.
Sure. No, it really is. It's staggering to think. And when I was first writing up my business plan 8 years ago now for BIT, the numbers at that time, were like, again, I sometimes it's baffling to think. So, the number that's widely accepted for just the blind, visually impaired community is right around 70% for unemployment. And when you include the underemployment numbers, it's near 80%. And the numbers are actually higher for, they're a little bit lower than that for, call it the deaf or hard of hearing community. They're a little bit higher for that for the people on the spectrum, so autism, that sort of thing, community. So it's in defining disability. So the statistics, and then per the United Nations, and there was an article that was put out about BIT on December 3rd of 2020 that the United Nations actually quote the number of 1 in 7 people on the planet identify with a disability. And the United States has the best numbers on the planet when it comes to employment for people with disabilities. So again, all you have to do is extrapolate, what that looks like with our portion of that demographic, and then start to push it out to the global numbers, right? But also to recognize that, so we so many times, Mo, and you've heard me talk about like technology is the solution to help people with disabilities find employment, and to be able to not only find employment, but be able to deliver, to be able to perform. Because at the end of the day, like, you don't hire me because I'm the token blind guy and it makes you feel good. You hire me because I'm a badass engineer, and I help bring solutions and help solve for problems to help move your business along. So But so when you start thinking about the like how to define disability, so per the World Health Organization, which up until the pandemic, most people had not heard of the WHO, but it's been around a minute.
Yep.
Um, the with a leading cause of disability globally is depression. So the leading cause of disability globally is depression.
Yes.
And and that was before the pandemic. Now with the
So
pandemic again,
imagine now. Yeah, imagine now. It's got to
yeah.
be because
But there are
we know we're in a mental health absolute crisis.
crisis, absolutely. And so we talk about again, I go back to that statement I made. Well, technology is the great mitigator. It's the medium in which people with disabilities are able to perform, able to deliver, even with mental health challenges, right? There are biotech solutions that help people identify if something is triggering an anxiety episode, if to help individuals from a technology perspective keep their situation in check, right?
Yep.
So again, I go back to as a blind person, blind engineer. You got to see this firsthand with your amazing app, Mo. Like, right? Like I came back with, and I was able to, tool around and motor around on your tool, no problem. And that's because accessible technology is ubiquitous.
Yep.
It is pervasive. It is everywhere. And so as a blind person, I'm able to do things using accessible technology. And yet the feedback I was able to give you was very spot on, right? Like, so again, building technology to be inclusive to everybody is just good business. And as a business owner, that's what you were looking for.
And everybody benefits. I was just thinking about this, Mike. Just yesterday, I was using Microsoft Transcribe in Microsoft Word, right? Where I was taking one of these recordings and playing it and using that transcription so that I can include transcriptions in all of our, we post these out on our blog so that if I'm a part of the deaf community, I can read what you and I versus and you and I have talked about this in terms of Zoom. We're using Zoom, and I can't wait until Zoom actually has live closed captioning happening on their platform, and I know it's coming.
Absolutely.
But
Well,
everybody wins. Everybody wins with inclusive tech.
Well, and we talked about this before, Mo, right? Like so how many people that are using Teams, the transcribe, where all of a sudden now, yes, this accessible technology feature absolutely helps the deaf and hard of hearing community, 100%. However, I can tell you this, there are organizations globally that are using that. They're turning this on, not because there are deaf employees, but because they're taking live meeting minutes. Exactly. And so now historically, you can go back and search, say, oh, no, like if there's ever a problem or a question with, let's say, gathering requirements from the technology team to the business, and the business, the business never does this, but let's say they're like, oh, I didn't say that. You can actually go back and say, well, actually you did. So we built a tool that you were. Yeah. But so this accessible technology can be used for so much more. We think of accessible technology that it's just for people with disabilities. And yet again, kind of historically, to know that the automatic opening doors at every airport, every mall, every shopping center that everybody uses, those automatic opening doors came from the community of the wheelchair community.
Right.
And yet who doesn't use that? Same thing, email started because it was a ubiquitous tool for deaf people to be able to communicate with sighted people and people who could hear. And yet everybody uses email, voice to text, text to voice technologies. Hey Siri, hey Alexa, hey Google. That all came from the blindness community. How many people are using those technologies nowadays? So again, accessible tech is good for all of humanity.
So now let's talk about, and if people want to dig in on that, I had a conversation with Morris 2 weeks ago, so you can watch that recording where we were talking, really did a deep dive on accessible tech. I want us to talk about now what some of the social societal barriers are to employment with people with disabilities. And one of the things that I find really interesting that I want to maybe frame our conversation is how many people don't even know what ableism is. So, we know what racism is, we know what misogyny is, we know what homophobia is, but people are like, ableism, what's ableism? And that
Right.
it's
Well,
so pervasive in our thinking about people with disabilities to that suddenly, because you have a disability, that makes you somehow less capable to perform at work. And that's just that there's like disconnect isn't even a strong enough word for that. Um, so let's where does this come from, and how are you tackling it at Blind Institute of Technology to get these employers to understand, wow, this is an amazing talent pool. We're not going to, this isn't tokenism. Like, I'm getting phenomenal talent.
I love the question, and I love the direction you're going with this, Mo, because ultimately, like, if you think about like how I started off, like, we Blind Institute of Technology act as a nonprofit staffing agency to literally some of the biggest brands on the planet, helping them with very intentional recruiting and retaining efforts within the people with disabilities community. And we like to say very strategically that we're talking professionals with disabilities, because there are a lot of organizations that look at the disabled community. And these are Fortune 100, Fortune 200 brands, unfortunately, that only look at the people with disabilities community for what's called food, filth, or fauna kind of initiatives. We, BIT, focus very strategically on professionals with disabilities. And so with that said, so the how people with disabilities are able to perform and deliver, it's through accessible tech. Okay, so that's great. So when I'm talking to an organization, getting over that, what I call how hump, is super critical. Now, that's not the only part of the equation that we have to talk about. And it is this, okay, cool. How do blind people do X, Y, and Z? And breaking down stigmas and perceptions. So it's also good historically to understand that the people with disabilities community is only about 100 years old. Mm-hmm. From all of humanity. Okay, so what does that mean? Obviously, there were blind people a lot longer than 100 years ago. There were deaf people a lot longer. There were people who were born with major physical disabilities way more than 100 years ago. However, as a community, Mo, it was about 101 years ago now, 102 years ago now, that a major global event happened that created this huge influx of people with disabilities globally. It's called World War I.
Yep.
And at that point in time, there was no other time in history where there was such an influx of people with profound physical and mental post-traumatic. They didn't call it post-traumatic stress back then, but trust me, there were a lot of both physical and invisible disabilities that came out of that space. And so at that point in time, the industrialized countries across the globe, you can go back historically and start realizing that then there started becoming legislation and policy in place to support that demographic.
Yep.
Okay, so as a community, quite honestly, it's one of those things like, how do you identify a culture? How do you identify yourselves as being part of a culture, with humanity that's been going on for thousands of years, and you really are only about 100 years old? And if you go back before that, like, so many people with disabilities, like, they were quite honestly sent off to institutions. Absolutely. They were not part of the mass community.
Right.
So you have to realize, like, we have to overcome and insert ourselves into everyday society, everyday community efforts. And that's why I say employment to me is the number one vehicle in which you can achieve this.
Yes.
The
Yes.
number one vehicle is employment. And so we're always having to explain to individuals like, um, I go back to there two PhDs, Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So Daniel Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for Economics in
Okay.
2002 for the theory of behavioral economics,
Uh-huh.
loss aversion. And loss aversion simply is people. Uh, oh gosh, the actual definition. Of course, I'm drawing a blank on it right now. It's basically people will have they're opposed to. Let's say it's more painful for somebody to lose $5 than it is to have the equivalent gain. So in other words, the reason why the lottery is so appealing because you spend $1, but you have the ability to win $1 million. Well, so that's from the economic side. Well, from a psychology or sociology perspective, when people meet somebody that is blind or in a wheelchair, it immediately triggers this loss aversion.
Mm.
And when you, so again, I've yet to meet anybody who has not said, okay, is it, would you rather be deaf or would you rather be blind? Would you rather, because people look at those conditions as so life changing for them.
People
So
ask,
it's
people ask my daughter all the time, and I know many of you are familiar with this series, and she's actually been on this series. She's a little person. She gets asked all the time, Mike, if she could, would she be born average sized? Um, right, like these questions. So keep going. I
Yep.
think I know where you're going here.
Yeah. So, and I, not to go off on a tangent, but this loss aversion is super important when you recognize, like, okay, this affects people's psychology from everyday purchasing power to hiring, hiring. Because again, it is impossible. Like, and these are natural behaviors that happen inside of all of humanity. So, loss aversion is something that happens to all of humanity.
Yep.
So again, that's why Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for Economics. With this, he was able to prove this as a theory. And so so if you extrapolate that out to again, like, so person with, so you get 3 MBAs that show up. Okay. We'll just make it simple. All 3 are Caucasian. All 3 are male. One has an obvious disability. We'll call it blindness or deafness. Okay. And since the hiring process is so subjective, right, it's going to be so easy for a hiring manager to say, well, this other candidate just happened to be and da 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 da. And you could say the same thing if we throw in ethnicity, you can throw the gender, relationship orientation, you can throw that same concept in with any of this. But with people with disabilities, again, there's a fear, there's a true fear of that. And, I also like to, so let's say you've ever met somebody, we've all got friends and family, devastating news, they come down with terminal cancer or some kind of terminal diagnosis. We as a human species, we actually don't know how, because we as a human species have this thing called empathy. So we're able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And when we're able to do that, we're like, I have no idea how I would react. I don't know what to do. And many people will actually avoid even talking to people who come down with those diagnoses because they're putting themselves in other shoes and it makes them feel super uncomfortable. Well, think about that for people with disabilities. They meet somebody, again, who's blind, who's deaf, who's in a wheelchair, who's a little person. They would rather avoid that person. Well, of course, that's just in everyday interactions. Well, of course, in the workplace, right? If you're thinking like, man, I got to work around this uncomfortable thing all the time. I'm not able to define it, but boy, there's just this quality I really felt in this other potential employee, right? So much of this is, it's a psychological game that we people with disabilities have to own this. And how do we insert ourselves in showcase? Like, yeah. No, I get that. But part of being uncomfortable helps us grow as well.
And helping, so there's also this getting beyond people seeing you in a one-dimensional way, right? That all you are is your disability, and that somehow that disability is um, the the lens that able-bodied folks look at disability through is loss, as you were saying. And I had never connected those things, and I can't wait to dig in on this, Mike, because like light bulbs are going off everywhere for me in terms of ideas. So then what do we do? How do we get
Right.
leaders, teams, hiring managers to understand this? And then how do we get over that hump?
Sure. Well, that how hump exactly. So much of what, so our approach is like saying, okay, so you're not going to be able to reprogram everybody all at once. However, you start one organization at a time. You start one hire at a time. You create this momentum that, again, we are part of the global economy. And this is where business is. So you can start doing this truly from the consumer side of things, recognizing that people with disabilities have more disposable income. And this is per the Accenture 2020 Disability Index report. So it came out just a year ago, Accenture Disability Index report, that people with disabilities here in America have more disposable income than both the Latinx and African American communities combined.
Hmm.
Okay, so from a how perspective, recognizing, so if you're a business but if your digital assets are not accessible, A, shame on you because it is the law.
Yep.
But B, shame on you because you're missing out financially. You're missing out on a business opportunity. And if the reason why you're not doing it is because you're afraid, business is scary, ladies and gentlemen. And if you're not motivated by being able to have your services be able to serve more individuals that actually have disposable income, then you need to check your business license at the door, right? So recognizing, so so the how factor is just spreading the word, recognizing like, no, you're doing this because it's good business. Well, then to realize like, oh, to make your digital assets accessible. So then let's go back to the medium of people being able to be productive and deliver is through accessible tech. And if you're having to make your user experience accessible, recognizing that investment can also apply for internal systems.
Yes.
And there's no better solution for accessibility that comes out than, so if you just put a whole bunch of able-bodied people to go make your stuff accessible and you never use the disability community, it's going to be a horrible user experience. And there are so many great illustrations and experiments that have been done like that. Like when you include people with disabilities, that's when your user experience actually, again, will go back to the automatic opening doors. Yep. Or these very pervasive, accessible technologies. When you do that using the people with disabilities community, you end up with a far better user experience, period. Well, and so again,
I was just going to say that consumer product, I've used the example before, the OXO brand, which is, like kitchen can openers and measuring cups. And that brand came to life because it was a husband and wife, and she had rheumatoid arthritis, right? And it was all about how do we create these products that I can use, that has turned into this one of the top, kitchen brands and making boatloads of money. and everybody loves.
Well, there's
I as somebody that doesn't have rheumatoid arthritis love those brands because they're so great to use.
Their user experience is phenomenal. And what's the I forget she created basically a tool brand for women because so many tools are meant for larger hands for men and that sort of thing. So she went out and created this completely boutique brand of tools that fit women, and now she's a multi-billionaire, right? And so recognizing that user experience, like you're not doing this because like it's just philanthropic. You're doing this because it makes good business sense.
Well,
and so then you start.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, and then when you realize, okay, from a business perspective, well, if people with disabilities are able to go out there and buy this kind of stuff, wow, I wonder what they're able to do internally inside of our ecosystem as well. So to me, it's always a business case when we're like you're saying, well, how do we get over this how hump? It's through the business lens. Like there are so many organizations that are out there that how they want to make an organization be more accessible. They're going to sue. So their whole business plan is through suing, which is totally fine. Again, that's their prerogative, and maybe it's made some changes. However, I've asked their leadership of those organizations very specifically, very directly. So how many times is employment part of your remediation plan? Right. And there's crickets, there's silence. So to me, if you want long-term sustainable global impact within the people with disabilities community, we need to elevate them on a professional basis. We need to elevate them into our businesses, because there's no representation for people with disabilities in the Fortune 10,000 leadership space, and obviously in our legislation. Like, the only way to do that is we got to realize that we have economic value.
Well, and there's it's oh my gosh, Mike, I'm like, I knew I have so many comments and follow-ons, right? Even like if you start with legislation, there's the Black Caucus, there's the Women's Caucus, there's and we don't have a caucus around people with disabilities. The only one that, right, is visibly that comes to mind is Tammy Duckworth. And there are so many people with invisible disabilities who don't want to share those because of what you were
Stigma and
talking
perception.
with
Yep.
loss
Yep.
aversion and perception.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
The stigma is huge. It's painful. And again, one of the ways and I feel like now, so, okay, doom and gloom, blah, blah, blah. But I think now is there's never been a greater time, even with the, with the current president, and how, open he was from a derogatory and condescending perspective around people with disabilities. There's never been a greater time in history than now for people with disabilities to actually just be, again, it's been 100 years of our community kind of being embarrassed about this. The LGBTQIA plus community and the amazing, just the amazing
right,
kind of maturation of that community.
right.
And yes, we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah. Yep.
But,
What's interesting? So I see some things, Mike. So for example, here finally in the US, we no longer have just the Olympics and just the Paralympics. We're finally Team USA, right? And this just happened last year, where they finally said it's not two different movements. And the Paralympic movement came about from World War II, right? And veterans and getting veterans into sport. And so I think when you say we have this moment, I could not agree more, because in all of the difficulty from work from home, that it's been an amazing thing for many people with disabilities who've been asking for some of these things to happen. And now magically, because it was impacting able-bodied people, all of these, oh yeah, you can work from home. Yes, we can have this tech, we can do these different things. So it's sort of seizing on this moment to create this wave.
I love it. And that's exactly what so the pandemic, in some kind of weird way, and again, not saying this lightly, because it affected people's lives permanently in so many tragic ways and continues to do so. However, there was a global experiment that took place last year, and that was this teleworking environment. And one of the challenges, true physical actual challenges for people with disabilities many times, is that logistical kind of component. So, because yes, there are, call it 8-10 cities in the United States that are really, really accessible, right? However, there are a ton of markets, job places that are just not that accessible. Mass transit isn't a priority, or very little of a priority. And yes, ride sharing is fantastic. However, super expensive everyday kind of option for people with disabilities. So all of a sudden now, this whole talking about how productive telework can be is only an asset for people with disabilities broadly.
Yep. And You and I have talked about this. I've said this again. I um if I have a problem that I want solved, I am going to bring in a person with a disability if I can, because y'all are life hackers, right? You are in a world that is designed not for you, right? An inaccessible world, and so you're problem solving all day long. And when you say, you're a badass engineer because you're blind, not in spite of, right? Like it is a power, like the deep listening, which by the way, Mike, I know it's got to be a somewhat of a nightmare being in conversation with me because my son has pointed out to me that I stop sentences and finish them with my hands a lot of the time, and I get really excited and I tend to interrupt. And so I know I'm killing you with your deep listening skills that are such a superpower.
No, I enjoy it, and I hear the passion that comes from you, Mo. And I love having conversations with fellow, passionate folks. And so it's not killing me whatsoever. I'll get on a tangent, and so it's good for me to practice that. Like, because in person there are times that, quite honestly, I miss visible cues that somebody has a question. I'll miss that.
Right.
Absolutely. And so I'm not saying that, there aren't things that, quite honestly, like, we've got everything figured out. However, I love, again, so much of our sales pitch from a blind institute of technology perspective to, and there's only a select few. I only believe that there's only about 10% of the Fortune 10,000. Like, I'm using a broad, like, I only believe there's only about 10% of those organizations that truly are interested in hiring from the professionals with disabilities community. I know that's a sad statement, but I truly believe that. And you just got to go out there and look at, how many organizations with Black Lives Matter. It was a one social media post, and then crickets, right? So again, to go out there and find organizations that are truly committed to people with disabilities, it's a shorter list. But
Well,
when I'm selling to them, I'm explaining to them, like, we like, we're innovative. Like, to your point, like, you don't hire us because it's philanthropic. You hire us because if you're looking for a demographic of problem solvers, that's
yeah,
our MO. So I
yeah.
love that you said that, because that's exactly what we sell.
Well, and I think what's interesting, I think about this loss aversion and how many times, again, uh, being the parent of a person with a very visible disability, um, and seeing that response day in and day out. One of the thinking about one of the reasons that we created the app was like, God, so somebody's like, oh, is it hearing loss? Is it hearing impairment? Is it blind? Is it visually impaired? Like, even what words do I use? Because people are so afraid of, and now layering on the loss aversion, but so afraid of saying or doing something, so then there's this weird awkwardness that happens.
Yep.
And so the app for us was like, all right, let's give people tools to get past just sort of just some of those logistics of,
Just, yeah,
until
almost inclusion vernacular, right?
right, and until I get to know you, right, and or and some things in there, in terms of, how do I make a workplace accessible, and you and I, what I'm going to do, because I keep lightly bringing this up in different of these conversations. I want us to have a panel around the word accommodations, because it is not my favorite word, because it really comes through as, oh, I'm accommodating you, Mike, versus I'm giving you a workspace and a workplace that everybody else gets. Um, and so I just went off
Well,
on a tangent there, but I think so if we can start with the business case and then give people tools to figure out how their role in whatever diversity somebody brings in making that person feel included and like they belong. And then, right, like proximity. And I
I
think it's sort of one of those, wow, I've worked with Mike, and he's hilarious and he's brilliant and he's like bringing, okay, now when we are going to hire Rashida or whoever else, it becomes, I think, easier, right? When you're not the only, when you're not the token. And so I would imagine a part of what you're doing with organizations is really an overall plan, not just let's bring in one person, but what's your long-term strategy? Is that fair to say?
100%. Well, it
Yeah.
is, but I think it's super invaluable for you to bring up the. So again, when you start thinking of like, okay, what are the 800 and there are multiple, what are the 800-pound gorillas in the room when for opposition for yes, there's loss aversion, that's a for real thing, but the people ask, okay, what is the reasonable accommodations like, and reasonable accommodation is a very legal oriented term. um,
Yep.
and so how do you put some black and white around this very fuzzy legal term? And so I ask people all the time. I'm like, okay, well, are you a and we're super proud of this. Like we're the official Salesforce training provider for people with disabilities globally,
Awesome.
and which is super exciting. And so I ask organizations, so are you a Salesforce shop? And and whether you're a government agency or private entity, because it's the most ubiquitous CRM on the planet, right? Like it's highly likely that you are, you have some kind of Salesforce, ecosystem within your enterprise. And so they're like, well, yeah, of course we have Salesforce. And I'm like, okay, well, guess what? Salesforce has already made their application 100% accessible for the hardest use case out there, the totally blind person.
Yep.
So the reasonable accommodation has already been made.
Done.
Say, okay, what are you a Google? Are you a Google shop? Are you a
Yep.
Microsoft shop?
Yep.
Do you have your teammates using Apple products, right? Like,
Yep.
so guess what? Those organizations have done so much of the heavy lifting, making sure that their user experience is accessible, and so therefore the reasonable accommodation is done.
Done.
Okay,
Done.
so then let's start talking about let's go back to the logistics and the pandemic and this telework environment. Guess what? There's no more of an excuse for organizations to say, well, oh, well, we're working from home, we don't have that policy. Every organization on the planet now has a work from home policy.
Yep.
Done.
Yep. Yep. Done.
Right. So reasonable accommodations, like let's start talking about what those really look like for individuals.
Yeah.
And especially for the invisible disabilities, where sometimes the workplace is so damn hectic that whether it's depression or anxiety or a combination of any of those mental health challenges, working from home many times or having the option of doing it a couple days a week it's good for their headspace.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So again, let's just talk about what reasonable accommodations, what they allow. They allow us to be more productive.
Right.
They
Right.
allow us to deliver.
Right.
Make it a business conversation.
Right. It allows you to deliver superior results. And right, full stop. Okay, Mike, you and I could keep talking forever. I'm looking at the time. I want you to leave me with
Yes.
one last truth bomb.
Oh, a truth bomb. Oh, Mo. Ladies, truly, ladies and gentlemen, like I get it. Like many times I know this, that I'm sometimes the first blind professional that people have ever met.
Yep.
And that if you were blessed, fortunate, whatever term, to be born without an obvious physical challenge, that it can seem scary, like total darkness. You don't know what to say, how to say it to folks who are blind, visually impaired, people who are deaf, people who are in wheelchairs. You don't know what to say or how to say it. I get that. There's real psychological, sociological evidence out there with loss aversion that says it's uncomfortable. However, again, we all know, whether you're into fitness or not, our muscles actually grow. This is scientific, based on putting strain and making your muscles uncomfortable. Our brains do the same thing. Our social interactions are right there with that. That we become stronger as a society by putting ourselves in slightly uncomfortable situations. And from that outcome, by making ourselves okay with being a little bit uncomfortable, what happens is we end up with a superior business experience and a superior sociological experience. So we're not a small demographic globally, 1 in 7 people. Be okay with being uncomfortable and just maybe start the conversation like, I don't know what to say or how to say it. Okay, put the onus on me. Put the onus on your fellow persons with a disability. Just don't ignore it. We're not going away.
Oh, I want to go into 12 more things just based on that, Mike. I'm going to wrap up this conversation. That incredible, incredible. So many good things. Y'all, Mike, give us the website, and I'll put that in the notes as well for Blind Institute of
Sure.
Technology.
Yeah, it's either blindinstituteoftechnology.org or also blindit.org. Blind is an unable to see. And I'm super available, Mike at blindit.org, Mike at blindit.org. So please, ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking to improve your business in any way, shape, or form, add true dollars to your bottom line. It's being inclusive to the people with disabilities community. So yeah, thank you so much, Mo. I'm super honored to be on this amazing platform of yours, and so appreciate us being able to make this happen beginning of 2021.
Yeah, let's everybody get uncomfortable, be okay with being uncomfortable, because on the other side of that is inclusion and belonging, and everybody wins in that world. So Mike, thank you, and we will see you all next week on Everyday Inclusion and Belonging.